I knew something was wrong before I even turned onto my street. Usually when you round the corner of Oak View Drive, you see it. It's the first thing you see, a massive towering crown of green that rises like a guardian over the rooftops. It was a white oak estimated to be over 200 years old. It was there before the subdivision. It was there before the road. It was there before the country was even fully formed. It was the reason I bought the property. But when I turned the corner that Friday afternoon, returning from a 3-day business trip, the sky was empty. There was just a gap, a jagged blue hole where my history used to be. My stomach dropped so hard I almost pulled the truck over. I felt sick, physically sick. I floored the gas. As I pulled into my driveway, the devastation hit me like a physical blow. My yard was covered in a layer of sawdust so thick it looked like snow. Massive rounds of wood, my wood, were stacked haphazardly near the curb, and there in the center of the yard was the stump. It was 6 feet wide. The hardwood was still bright and wet, bleeding sap onto the ground. Standing over it, holding a clipboard and looking incredibly pleased with himself, was the HOA president, a man named Gerald Sterling. He saw my truck. He didn't look guilty. He looked proud. He thought he had finally cleaned up the neighborhood. He thought he had won a battle over leaves and shade. What Gerald didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend in his small, petty mind, was that he hadn't just cut down a tree. He had just committed a felony. And thanks to a little-known state law regarding timber trespass and trouble damages, he had just bankrupted the entire homeowners association. He thought the tree was a nuisance. The court would later decide it was worth $1.22 million. To understand the magnitude of this crime, you have to understand the tree. This wasn't some overgrown pine or a rotting birch. This was a Circus alba, a white oak. My property was an outlier. Decades ago, when the developers bought this farm to turn it into the estates at Rolling Hills, the original farmhouse was carved out. The developers built around it. I bought the house 5 years ago. It was a fixer-upper, but I didn't buy it for the house. I bought it for the tree. The oak sat on the far edge of my lot, its branches spreading out over 100 feet. It provided shade for 3 neighboring yards, whether they wanted it or not. It was a literal ecosystem. Owls lived in it. Squirrels, generations of birds. It was a landmark. When I moved in, I hired a master arborist to inspect it. This is a champion, he told me, looking up in awe. You don't see them this big anymore. Not in the suburbs. This tree is healthy. It's strong. And if you take care of it, it'll be here for another 100 years. I took that responsibility seriously. I spent thousands on specialized feeding, pruning, and lightning protection. I didn't own the tree. I was its caretaker. Then came the HOA. Technically, my deed had a covenant that tied me to the HOA, but because my lot was the historic plot, I had exemptions. I didn't have to follow their architectural style for the house. I didn't have to plant their approved cookie-cutter shrubs. But Gerald Sterling didn't care about exemptions. Gerald was a retired middle manager who treated the HOA presidency like it was the Oval Office. He walked the neighborhood daily, measuring grass height and checking for unauthorized garden gnomes. He hated the oak. He called it the mess. He hated that it dropped acorns on the sidewalk. He hated that in October it dropped leaves that blew into the pristine yards of the newer houses next door. He hated that it was wild. It doesn't fit the aesthetic, he told me once, standing in my driveway. The estates is about uniformity, clean lines. That thing is chaotic. That thing is older than your bloodline, Gerald. I told him, leave it alone. He narrowed his eyes. Trees that pose a hazard can be removed by the Board for Community Safety. Bylaw Section 4.2. It's not a hazard, I said. I have the arborist reports to prove it. We'll see, he said. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I had the law on my side. I forgot that to a man like Gerald, the law is just an obstacle to be bulldozed. The war started with letters. It always does. Notice one complaint regarding excessive debris, leaves on community roadways. Owner must mitigate. I ignored it. It's autumn. Trees have leaves. Notice 2. Safety concern. Several residents have reported falling branches. The board requests an immediate safety inspection by an HOA-approved vendor. I replied immediately. I sent them the report from my master arborist dated 2 months prior. It certified the tree as structurally sound with no imminent risk. I told them in writing, no highway vendor is permitted on my property. The tree is healthy. Do not touch it. Gerald didn't like being told no. He escalated. He started finding me for the acorns, $50 for unsightly debris, $100 for failure to maintain landscaping. I paid the fines. It was cheaper than fighting a lawsuit, and I figured he would eventually get bored and move on to harassing someone about their trash cans. That was my mistake. I underestimated his obsession. 2 weeks before the incident, I came home to find a guy in a Huss vest standing in my yard looking up at the tree. I stormed over. Can I help you? Just doing a bid, the guy said. A bid for what? Removal, he said. The guy in the golf cart, Mr. Sterling, said this thing is coming down next week. I saw red. I kicked the guy off my property. He was actually polite about it. He didn't know it was a dispute. Then I marched down to Gerald's house. I didn't knock. I rang the bell until he answered. If you set 1 foot on my property, I told him, pointing a finger in his face, I will call the cops. That tree is not yours. It is not on common ground. It is mine. Gerald smirked. It was that smug, condescending smirk that only petty tyrants have. The board has voted. He said, we have deemed it a community hazard. We have the right to abate hazards. It's in the bylaws. The bylaws don't supersede property law. Gerald, I said, I have a certified arborist report. If you touch that tree, you will regret it. I'm just thinking of the children, he said. Imagine if a branch fell on a child. Get off my land, I said. I went home. I called my lawyer. He sent a cease and desist letter via certified mail the next morning. I thought that would stop him. A cease and desist is illegal. Back off. I went on my business trip on Wednesday thinking the tree was safe. I was wrong. Back to that Friday afternoon. I was standing in the sawdust. The smell was overwhelming. The sharp, tangy scent of fresh oak sap. It smelled like death. Gerald was standing there watching me. You're trespassing, I said. My voice was surprisingly calm. It was the calm of absolute shock. Actually, Gerald said, adjusting his glasses, I'm supervising a necessary safety abatement. We tried to do this the easy way, but you refused to cooperate. So, the board exercised its emergency powers. He gestured to the stump. Much better. Look at that sky. The neighbors are already thanking me. No more leaves. I looked at the stump. I looked at the massive logs stacked up. They hadn't even ground the stump yet. They had just felled it, bucked it, and left the mess. Where is the crew? I asked. They went to lunch, Gerald said. They'll be back to haul the wood away. We're going to bill you for the removal, by the way. It was $4,500. We'll add it to your monthly dues. I laughed. It was a dark, dry laugh that made Gerald take a step back. You're going to bill me? I asked. Standard procedure for hazard abatement, he said, losing a bit of his confidence. I pulled out my phone. Gerald, I said, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not going to bill me. You are not going to haul this wood away. You're going to leave my property right now. Or what? He challenged. Or I'm going to make sure the police report says resisting arrest in addition to felony trespass. I dialed 911. I'd like to report a crime in progress. Significant property damage and trespassing. The perpetrator is still on the scene. Gerald rolled his eyes. The police won't do anything. It's a civil matter. It's an HOA dispute. Cutting down a tree isn't a dispute, Gerald. I said it's destruction of property. The police arrived 10 minutes later. Gerald immediately went into his I'm the president routine. He showed them the bylaws. He talked about safety hazards and emergency votes. The officer, a young guy who looked overwhelmed, turned to me. "Sir, this does look like a civil matter." "If the HOA has rules, officer," I said, "this tree was not on common ground. It was on my private property. I have a cease and desist order that was signed for by this man 2 days ago." I showed him the photo of the receipt on my phone. He knowingly entered private property and destroyed an asset worth a substantial amount. This is criminal mischief. The officer looked at the stump. He looked at the massive size of it. "Okay." The officer said, "I can't arrest him right now because he claims he had authority and that's for a judge to figure out, but I am writing a report. And Mr. Sterling, you need to leave this property immediately." Gerald huffed. "Fine. But the wood stays. The HOA paid to cut it. The HOA keeps the wood. If you touch one stick of that wood," I said, "I will tackle you." Gerald left. I was left alone with the stump. I walked over to it. I counted the rings. 10, 20, 50, 100. I stopped counting at 180. I sat down on the wood and cried. Then I wiped my eyes. I stood up and I called the most expensive lawyer in the state. The next morning, my legal team assembled. My lawyer, a shark named David, brought in a consulting arborist who specialized in forensic valuation. His name was Dr. Thorne. He was a quiet man with a beard carrying a tape measure and a camera. Dr. Thorne spent 4 hours at the crime scene. He measured the diameter of the stump, 74 inches. He took samples of the wood to test for rot or disease. He photographed the canopy spread based on the debris field. He interviewed me about the history of the tree, asking for old photos. When he came into the kitchen to give us his preliminary report, he looked grim. "Well," David asked, "what are we looking at?" Dr. Thorne took off his glasses. This was a healthy Circus alba. Based on the growth rings, it was approximately 215 years old. It was a heritage specimen in excellent health. He paused. Gerald claimed it was a hazard. "Yes," I said. "He's a liar," Thorne said. "The heartwood is solid as a rock. There was no rot. This tree would have stood for another century." "What's the value?" David asked. "We need a number for the lawsuit. This is where it gets interesting. In tree law, there are different ways to value a tree. If it's a timber tree like a pine farm, you value it by the lumber. But a residential tree, a heritage tree, you use the trunk formula method. It calculates the cost to replace the tree with the largest available transplantable tree and then compounds that cost based on the size difference, species, condition, and location." Dr. Thorne did some math on his notepad. "To replace this tree, well, you can't buy a 200-year-old oak. The largest we could transplant is maybe a 10 inches caliper tree to get the equivalent biomass and canopy." He punched some numbers into a calculator. "The base value of the tree is approximately $415,000. I choked on my coffee. $415,000. It was a massive perfect specimen in a high-value residential area. Thorne said, "That's the amenity value." David, my lawyer, smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "That's the base value," David said. "Now, let's talk about the statute." He pulled out a law book. "In our state, if timber trespass is found to be intentional and malicious, meaning they knew they didn't have permission and did it anyway, the court awards treble damages." "Treble?" I asked. "Triple," David said. He did the math on a piece of paper and slid it across the table to me. $415,000 x 3 equals $1,245,000 plus legal fees, David added, plus the cost of stump grinding and remediation. He looked at me. "We are going to sue the HOA and Gerald Sterling personally for $1.5 million. I looked at the number. It was a life-changing amount of money. But looking out the window at that jagged stump, I would have burned the money in a heartbeat to get the tree back. Since I couldn't have the tree, I decided I would take the next best thing. I would take their neighborhood. We didn't file the lawsuit immediately. David wanted them to confess on the record. The monthly HOA meeting was the following Tuesday. I walked in. The room was packed. Word had spread about the incident. Gerald was at the front table looking confident. He had clearly spun a story to the neighbors about how he saved them from a dangerous tree. When the open forum section started, I stood up. "I'd like to speak," I said. Gerald sighed. "Make it quick. We have a lot of business." "I just have one question," I said. "For the minutes. Did the board officially vote to remove the tree on my property, and was it done intentionally despite my warnings?" Gerald spoke into the microphone. "Yes. The board voted unanimously to abate the nuisance. We acted within our authority to protect the community, and frankly you should be thanking us." "So it was intentional?" I asked. "Absolutely," Gerald said. "And we will be doing it again if you plant another unauthorized tree." David, who was sitting in the back row, stood up. He was holding a court stenographer's recorder. We had hired one to sit in. "Thank you, Mr. President." David said that admission is all we needed. Gerald squinted. "Who are you?" "I'm Mr. Miller's attorney," David said. He walked up to the front table and dropped a thick binder onto it. The thud echoed in the silent room. "You have just been served," David announced. "We are suing the Rolling Hills HOA and each board member individually for malicious trespass and destruction of property." Gerald laughed. "Go ahead. Our insurance will cover a few thousand for a tree." David smiled. "Mr. Sterling, you might want to check your policy. Most liability insurance covers accidents. It specifically excludes intentional illegal acts. You just admitted on record that this was intentional." David opened the binder to the page with the valuation, and it's not a few, 000. He pointed to the figure. "Our expert valuation puts the tree at $415,000 under state law because you acted with malice. That number is tripled." David looked at the shocked faces of the neighbors. "We are suing you for $1.25 million. The room erupted. Gerald looked at the paper. His face went white, then gray, then a color I've never seen on a human being before. That's impossible," he stammered. "It's just a tree." "It was a 200-year-old white oak," David said. "And you just bought it." The weeks that followed were a slow-motion car crash for the HOA. First, their insurance company did exactly what David predicted. They sent a letter denying coverage. The claim arose from an intentional malicious act by the board directors. This is a violation of the policy terms. Coverage denied. That meant the HOA was on the hook for the money. The HOA had about $50,000 in its reserve fund. They were short by about $1.2 million. The panic. The board held an emergency meeting. They were in full panic mode. They hired a defense lawyer, but he told them the same thing we did. You cut down a tree on private property after receiving a cease and desist. You have no defense. Settle. But they couldn't settle. They didn't have the money. The neighbors' turn. When the other homeowners realized what was happening, the mood shifted from curiosity to lynch mob. To pay the judgment, the HOA would have to issue a special assessment. Divided among the 100 homes in the subdivision, every single family would owe approximately $12,000. Imagine telling a young couple who just stretched to buy a home that they owe $12,000 because the HOA president didn't like a tree. The neighborhood turned on Gerald. They egged his house. They put for sale signs in his yard. They screamed at him in the street. The resignation. Gerald resigned in disgrace 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. He tried to sell his house and move, and this was the cherry on top. David filed a lease-pending lawsuit notice against Gerald's personal property as well. He couldn't sell his house until the lawsuit was resolved. He was trapped in the neighborhood he had ruined, surrounded by people who hated him. The settlement eventually we went to mediation. I didn't want to bankrupt the innocent neighbors mostly, but I wanted Gerald destroyed and I wanted the HOA neutered. We reached a deal. 1. The payout. The HOA handed over their entire reserve fund, $50,000. 2. The insurance. We found a loophole in the directors and officers. Insurance that covered a portion of the negligence. They paid out $400,000. 3. The personal cost. Gerald Sterling and the 2 other board members who voted for the cutting had to pay $50,000 each from their personal savings. David was brutal in the negotiation for the total. I walked away with about $600,000 after legal fees. But the money wasn't the best part. The best part was the dissolution. As part of the settlement, I demanded a community vote on the future of the HOA. Because the HOA was technically insolvent and facing a decade of rebuilding their reserves, the neighbors were furious. They voted 92-8 to dissolve the HOA entirely. The estates at Rolling Hills became just a regular neighborhood. No more architectural review committees. No more fines for grass height. No more Gerald Sterling measuring trash cans. It's been a year since the tree came down. I used a chunk of the settlement money to do something special. I couldn't put the tree back, but I could ensure its legacy. I hired a woodworker to mill the logs that Gerald had left in my yard. The wood was stunning, tight grain, creamy white with streaks of brown. I had a massive dining room table made. It sits in my house, a centerpiece. I also had 10 benches made. I donated them to the local park with plaques that read the Rolling Hills Oak 1800 to 2024. And in the center of the yard, right next to the stump which I had ground down, I planted a sapling. It's a white oak. It's only 4 foot tall right now. It looks tiny in that big open space, but it's strong. It has good soil, and it has an owner who knows exactly what it's worth. As for Gerald, he moved. He had to short sell his house to pay off his share of the settlement. I heard he moved to a condo in Florida. I hope he likes palm trees because if he touches one of those, I'm sure there's a lawyer down there waiting for him. They say money doesn't grow on trees. But in my case, a tree turned into a fortune and the weapon that destroyed a tyrannical HOA. I still miss the shade. I miss the owls. No amount of money can replace 200 years of history. But every time I look at my bank account or see my neighbors enjoying their freedom from the HOA, I smile. Gerald Sterling wanted to clean up the neighborhood. And in a way, he did. He cleaned himself right out of it. The lesson: if you have a special tree, protect it, document it. And if an HOA president ever stands in your yard and threatens to cut it down, don't get mad. Get a tape measure and let them dig their own $1 million hole. Have you ever had a neighbor destroy your property? Have you ever dealt with tree law? Tell me your story in the comments below. And if you want to see more stories where the little guy uses the law to crush a bully, hit that subscribe button. We're planting seeds of justice, one video at a time. Like, share and subscribe. HOA Battle.